There is a story that began quietly in the pages of a magazine long before most of the world had ever heard of it. It followed a boy with a tail, a girl with a radar, and a world full of strange creatures and stranger wishes. Tonight, we sit with that story, not rushing, not hurrying, just breathing alongside it. Subscribe if you'd like more calm Dragon Ball stories like this one, and let those memories carry you gently as we wander through 300 hidden corners of Dragon Ball Classic, beginning with how this whole extraordinary thing came to be. Akira Toriyama was not certain Dragon Ball would last. He had already built a reputation with his comedic science fiction manga, Dr. Slump, and the pressure of following that success weighed quietly on him as he sat at his desk in late 1984. The editorial staff of Weekly Shonen Jump encouraged him to try something new, something that moved faster, something built on action and travel, and the thrill of the unexpected. What emerged from those early conversations was not a grand plan. It was a seed, a boy, a ball with stars on it, a wish that could change the world. And somehow, out of that modest beginning, one of the most enduring stories in the history of animation quietly took its first breath. Dragon Ball was first published in Weekly Shonen Jump on December 3, 1984. The inaugural chapter introduced readers to Son Goku, a young boy living alone in a remote mountain forest, and Bulma, a teenage girl on a mission to collect 7 magical orbs that could summon a wish-granting dragon. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. The world that opened in those first panels was small, warm, and full of curiosity, a world that did not know yet just how large it was about to become. Toriyama drew his inspiration for Dragon Ball from a beloved piece of classical Chinese literature. Journey to the West, written in the 16th century by Wu Cheng-en, told the story of the Monkey King, Sun Wukong, a powerful and mischievous spirit who accompanied a Buddhist monk on a great pilgrimage. The parallels between Sun Wukong and Son Goku were intentional and deeply felt. Both characters shared enormous physical strength, a playful and honest spirit, and an origin tied to something wild and animal-like within them. Toriyama never hid this influence and spoke openly about it in various interviews throughout his career. The very name Son Goku is the Japanese reading of Sun Wukong's name written in Chinese characters. This connection was not a surface-level borrowing, but something that informed the character at his core. Sun Wukong traveled on a magical cloud and carried an extending staff, and Goku did precisely the same. The flying nimbus, which Toriyama called Kintoon in Japanese, carried Goku across enormous distances at great speed. The power pole, or Nyoibo, extended on command to extraordinary lengths, reaching from the ground all the way toward the clouds above. These were not coincidences. They were loving references placed carefully into the story by a creator who knew his source material well. Toriyama did not, however, simply retell Journey to the West. He took its spirit and reimagined it entirely. The world of Dragon Ball was not ancient China. It was a strange, colorful blend of modern technology and ancient tradition, a place where someone could drive a car in the morning and fight a martial arts tournament in the afternoon. Capsule technology allowed entire vehicles, houses, and submarines to be stored in objects no larger than a vitamin. The Capsule Corporation, founded by Dr. Bulma's father, was the dominant force behind this innovation. This blending of the ancient and the futuristic gave Dragon Ball its distinctive personality, something that felt both timeless and fresh. The manga ran as a weekly serial, meaning Toriyama had to produce new chapters under enormous time pressure. Weekly Shonen Jump was one of the most competitive publications in Japan, and maintaining a high-ranking series required consistent quality and reader engagement. Toriyama worked with a very small team throughout the Dragon Ball years. His assistant Minoru Maeda contributed to background artwork during particularly demanding periods, but the overwhelming majority of the drawing, writing, and design was handled by Toriyama himself. This singular creative control gave the series a consistency of vision that is still felt by readers today. Toriyama famously preferred simplicity in his designs. He disliked drawing elaborate clothing patterns, complex backgrounds, or overly detailed costumes. This preference shaped every character in Dragon Ball Classic. Goku's orange gi was simple and clean. Krillin's robes were straightforward. Yamcha's fighting clothes were practical. The backgrounds, while varied and imaginative, were rendered with an economical hand. This restraint, far from being a limitation, gave the series a kind of visual clarity that made it instantly readable and memorable. Even a child encountering Dragon Ball for the first time could take in a page and understand exactly who was who and what was happening. Son Goku was approximately 11 or 12 years old at the beginning of Dragon Ball, though the precise accounting of his age was complicated by his isolated upbringing. He had lived entirely alone in the mountains after the death of his grandfather, Grandpa Gohan, surviving by fishing and hunting with his bare hands. He had no formal education, no knowledge of cities or other people, and no understanding of basic social conventions. He did not know what a girl was. He had never seen a car. The world beyond his forest was to him a complete mystery, and this innocence was one of the most endearing qualities the character ever possessed. Grandpa Gohan had not been Goku's biological family. He had found a metal sphere in the mountains one day, and inside it was a baby, small, strange, with a monkey tail, and possessed of a ferocity that nearly cost the old man his life. Gohan gave the child a name, raised him with love, and taught him what he knew of martial arts. The child's name, Son Goku, was a gift from that old man. Gohan himself was named in the tradition of Japanese simplicity. The word Gohan means cooked rice, a staple of everyday life, warm and sustaining. In naming the child and in living beside him, Grandpa Gohan shaped everything Goku would become. The four-star Dragon Ball was the most treasured object in Goku's possession when the story began. Grandpa Gohan had kept it for him, and after Gohan's death, Goku wore it or kept it close, as a reminder of the man who had been his family. He did not fully understand what the Dragon Ball was. He knew only that it had belonged to his grandfather, and that made it irreplaceable. When Bulma arrived with her radar and explained that the ball was one of 7 magical orbs capable of summoning a wish-granting dragon, Goku was willing to travel with her, not for any wish of his own, but simply because the adventure appealed to him and because she promised to bring it back. Bulma Briefs was 12 years old when Dragon Ball began. She was the daughter of the brilliant Dr. Brief, and she had inherited his gift for invention. She built her Dragon Ball radar herself, using her understanding of the unique electromagnetic signature emitted by each orb. The radar could detect Dragon Balls at enormous distances and display their location on a small screen. This device was essential to the entire premise of the series, and the fact that a 12-year-old girl designed it spoke immediately to Bulma's extraordinary intellect. Her original goal in searching for the Dragon Balls was, in her own words, to wish for a perfect boyfriend. This small, personal, somewhat absurd wish established her as a character whose feelings and wants were entirely human and relatable. The Dragon Balls themselves were 7 perfect spheres, each containing a different number of glowing 5-pointed stars from 1 to 7. The stars did not indicate rank, power, or hierarchy. They were simply identifiers. After a wish was granted, the Dragon Balls scattered across the earth and turned to stone for exactly 365 days, after which they would become active again. This one-year reset was not simply a narrative convenience. It gave each collection quest a sense of genuine stakes and ensured that wishes could not be made frivolously or repeatedly without enormous effort. The rules around the Dragon Balls evolved gently over time, but this core rhythm remained constant. Shenron, the great dragon summoned by bringing all 7 Dragon Balls together, was a massive serpentine creature capable of granting a single wish to whoever called his name. His design was regal and imposing, coiled through the sky like living smoke, with green scales and eyes that glowed with ancient power. Despite his formidable appearance, Shenron was bound by certain limitations. He could not grant a wish beyond the power of his creator, who was Kami, the guardian of Earth. He could not bring back someone who had died of natural causes, and he could not grant the same wish twice. These constraints gave the Dragon Balls an internal logic that made their power feel both vast and finite. The Emperor Pilaf saga was the first major story arc in Dragon Ball Classic, and it established nearly every foundational element the series would build on. Pilaf was a small, self-important ruler who had spent years hunting the Dragon Balls in the hope of wishing for world domination. His two companions were Shu, a ninja in a dog-like costume who was hapless despite his professional title, and Mai, a serious female soldier whose stern expression was a constant counterpoint to Pilaf's bluster. The three of them were played for comedy throughout, and they never managed to feel genuinely threatening despite their repeated interference. That was precisely the point. The Emperor Pilaf saga concluded with what is perhaps the most quietly important moment in all of Dragon Ball Classic. Pilaf successfully gathered all 7 Dragon Balls and summoned Shenron. His wish for world domination was mere seconds from being granted, and then Oolong, a shape-shifting pig who had been traveling with Goku and Bulma, interrupted with a wish of his own. He shouted before Pilaf could speak, "A wish for a pair of women's underwear." Shenron, bound to honor the first wish spoken, granted it. The Dragon Balls scattered, and the world was saved by the most absurd wish imaginable. This moment captured Dragon Ball Classic in miniature, playful, unexpected, and completely earnest. Oolong's name, like many character names in Dragon Ball, was taken from a type of tea. This naming convention ran through many of the earliest characters and became one of the series' subtle internal jokes. Puar, Yamcha's small shape-shifting companion, was named after Pu'er tea, Bulma's family name. Briefs, connected to underwear, continued a tradition of clothing-adjacent wordplay that stretched across the entire Brief family. These naming choices were never announced or explained within the story. They were simply there, waiting for attentive readers to discover, like small gifts tucked into the margins of the pages. Oolong himself was a shapeshifter who had studied transformation techniques at a school for his kind. He had been expelled for stealing the teacher's underwear, a detail that explained both his skills and his character perfectly. His ability to transform was limited to 5 minutes per shift, after which he was forced to revert to his natural pig form. This limitation gave him a particular kind of anxious energy. He was never quite as powerful or reliable as a proper ally should be, and the series made gentle comedy out of the gap between his self-image and his actual capabilities. Despite this, he remained a consistent and affectionate presence throughout the classic era. Yamcha was introduced in the desert region as a bandit who robbed travelers passing through. He lived in the wastelands with Puar, and his dream was to move to the city and live a normal life, but his crippling fear of women made this impossible. The moment Bulma appeared, Yamcha froze. His bravado collapsed entirely. This specific vulnerability was one of the series' earliest character jokes, and it worked because it was played completely straight. Yamcha was otherwise a skilled fighter with genuine ability. His wolf fang fist technique was fast and powerful. The contrast between his fighting competence and his social paralysis was warm and funny, and it made him immediately likable. After the Emperor Pilaf arc, the story turned towards something more structured and focused. Goku and Krillin arrived at the Kame House, the home of the legendary turtle hermit, seeking training. Master Roshi, full name Muten Roshi, meaning invincible old master, was an ancient martial arts expert who had spent decades developing his techniques on a small island in the middle of the sea. He was also lecherous, eccentric, and deeply fond of reading magazines of a certain variety. This contradiction between profound mastery and absurd personal habits was one of the series' most enduring comedic wells. Roshi was simultaneously the greatest martial artist of his age and a complete embarrassment. The training Roshi devised was not combat-based in any conventional sense. He sent his 2 students out to deliver milk across an enormous mountainous region every morning, before dawn. They ran, carried, climbed, and exhausted themselves in a completely ordinary task that transformed their bodies through sheer repetition. They farmed under the summer sun. They swam in waters patrolled by sharks. They dodged a truck driven at speed across open ground. None of it looked like martial arts from the outside, but every element of it built the physical foundation that would carry them into the tournament. This arc remains one of the most fondly remembered training sequences in all of Dragon Ball Classic, precisely because it felt unglamorous and true. Krillin was not, at first, a friend to Goku. He arrived at the Kame house with a gift for Master Roshi, a stack of magazines, and a competitive ambition to become the world's greatest martial artist. He was calculating, a little sneaky, and initially used his wits rather than his heart in dealing with others. But training alongside Goku day after day changed something in him. The bond that formed between them was unhurried and genuine, built through shared exhaustion, shared jokes, shared meals. By the time the tournament approached, they were brothers in every meaningful sense. The friendship between Goku and Krillin would become one of the emotional pillars of the entire Dragon Ball franchise. Krillin's design carried specific visual meaning. The 6 small dots arranged across his forehead were incense burn marks, a reference to the rituals of certain Buddhist monks. Krillin had trained at a Shaolin-inspired temple before coming to Master Roshi, and these marks were a remnant of that time. He also, notably, had no visible nose. Toriyama designed him this way deliberately, and while no in-universe explanation was ever given, the absence became as much a part of Krillin as his shaved head or his orange robes. These small design details gave the character a personality that existed in his silhouette alone before he ever spoke a word. Master Roshi's signature technique, the Kamehameha, was one of the most consequential inventions in Dragon Ball history. It had taken Roshi 50 years to develop, 50 years of patient practice, refinement, and contemplation had produced a beam of compressed ki that could move mountains and extinguish fires the size of a city. Goku watched Roshi perform it once, just once, and replicated it from memory within moments. This was not treated as a simple trick in the story. It was a revelation of Goku's extraordinary natural potential. He had looked at something that had taken a master half a century to build, and his body had simply understood it. The name Kamehameha was drawn from the historical figure King Kamehameha I, the monarch who unified the Hawaiian Islands in the late 18th century. Toriyama chose the name because it sounded powerful and was satisfying to say, a word that felt like an attack even before it was won. He later expressed mild surprise at how thoroughly the name entered popular culture, becoming perhaps the single most recognized martial arts technique name in the world. Every child who has ever stretched out their hands and called the word has unknowingly honored both a Hawaiian king and the imagination of a man drawing at his desk in Nagoya. The 21st Tenkaichi Budokai was the first formal martial arts tournament in Dragon Ball Classic, and it introduced a structure that would define the series for decades to come. The tournament brought together fighters from across the world, each hoping to claim the title of the world's greatest martial artist. For Goku and Krillin, it was their first opportunity to test themselves against unknown opponents outside their small world of Kame Island and mountain forests. The arena, the crowd, the brackets, and the rules gave the story a new kind of tension, not survival, not adventure, but competition, where losing meant going home instead of dying. The first round introduced fighters who would become part of Dragon Ball's nostalgic fabric. Bacterian was a large man who had never once bathed in his entire life, and his technique was built entirely around using his overwhelming stench as a weapon. He was, by any external measure, revolting, and the sequence in which Krillin faced him was played for comedy and mild disgust in equal measure. Krillin won only after Goku reminded him, from across the arena, that Krillin had no nose, and therefore no ability to smell anything. It was a joke that rewarded those who paid attention to Krillin's design, and it resolved a comedic fight in the most perfectly absurd way possible. Guran was another memorable early opponent, a large reptilian creature who produced a sticky substance from his mouth called merry-go-round gum. The substance was nearly indestructible and it bound Goku's arms together at a critical moment, preventing him from fighting properly. Goku's tail had been cut off earlier in the tournament, robbing him of some of his power. And yet, even bound and diminished, Goku found a way to press forward. He grew his tail back in the middle of the match. The audience at the tournament was astonished. Goku simply accepted it as a useful development and continued fighting. This quiet resilience, this way of meeting impossibility with calm and proceeding anyway, was one of his defining traits. Nam was perhaps the most emotionally resonant fighter in the 21st Budokai. Though he competed only briefly, he was a man from a distant desert village where the wells had run dry. His people were dying of thirst. He had come to the tournament not for glory, but for the prize money, which was enough to buy water for his village and keep them alive. His desperation was never melodramatic. He simply fought with absolute seriousness, carrying the weight of his home in every punch. Bulma ultimately helped him find a solution outside the tournament, directing him to a water source his village could use. This small act of kindness was easy to miss, but it was characteristic of the series' gentle generosity. The final of the 21st Budokai placed Goku against a disguised fighter named Jackie Chun. Jackie Chun was, in fact, Master Roshi himself, wearing a wig and light disguise to conceal his identity. Roshi had entered the tournament not to win, though he could have done so easily, but to challenge his students and prevent them from becoming complacent with victory. If Goku and Krillin believed they had already achieved the greatest possible goal, they would stop growing. By entering and defeating them himself, Roshi ensured they would keep reaching. This act of intentional loss, dressed up as victory, was one of the most quietly wise things any character in the series ever did. Goku lost to Jackie Chun in the final. The match was close, genuinely close, and in the final exchange, Goku's body gave out first. He fell asleep standing up from sheer exhaustion, and Jackie Chun struck before he recovered. The loss was clean and felt right. Goku had been extraordinary for his age, but he was not yet the greatest. The tournament had done exactly what Roshi intended. Both boys left not defeated but inspired, hungry to train harder, to reach further, to return. This was the emotional cadence of Dragon Ball Classic at its purest. Not a story of winning, but a story of becoming. The Red Ribbon Army arc was the longest sustained narrative of Dragon Ball Classic, and the first time the series committed to something approaching genuine darkness within its adventurous frame. The Red Ribbon Army was a vast military organization with resources, weaponry, and global reach. It was ruled by Commander Red, a small, precise man in an immaculate uniform who projected the image of absolute authority. He wanted the Dragon Balls collected at any cost. His subordinates, generals, scientists, assassins operated across the world in pursuit of this goal. Goku stumbled into conflict with the army almost by accident, and what followed became one of the most ambitious story sequences in the classic era. Commander Red's true motivation, concealed until the final moments of the arc, was one of the most memorable reveals in Dragon Ball Classic. He did not want world domination. He did not want power in the conventional sense. He wanted, with the Dragon Balls, to wish himself taller. This man who had built an army, who had sent his soldiers to die in pursuit of 7 magical orbs, who had funded and commanded one of the most formidable organizations in the world, had done it all because he was short, and it had haunted him his entire life. When Staff Officer Black discovered this truth, he killed Commander Red in disbelief and assumed control of the army. The moment was darkly funny and quietly tragic in equal measure. Muscle Tower was among the most distinct locations in the Red Ribbon Army arc. It was a heavily fortified tower in a snowy northern region, commanded by General White, a cold and precise officer who maintained the structure as a prison and forward base. Each floor contained a different fighter or obstacle, and Goku moved through them one by one in a sequence that felt like a video game before video games regularly borrowed from manga. One of the most affecting encounters in the tower was with Android 8, a massive artificial being who had been programmed for combat but possessed an unmistakably gentle heart. He became Goku's ally almost immediately, and Goku gave him a nickname, Eighter, because the number 8 was stitched into his jacket. General Blue was among the most unsettling figures in the Red Ribbon Army, not for his size or his weapons, but for his psychic ability to paralyze opponents with his gaze. He could freeze a person in place through eye contact alone, leaving them standing immobile while he did as he wished. He was also fastidiously particular about his appearance and his ideals, which gave him a cold vanity that made him deeply unpleasant to spend time with. His pursuit of Goku through the ruins of an underwater pirate base and the cave systems beyond it formed one of the more genuinely suspenseful sequences of the classic era. He was eventually killed by mercenary Tao, dispatched with casual contempt in a single technique. Mercenary Tao Pai Pai was the most visually theatrical of the Red Ribbon Army's hired killers. He arrived for his missions by riding atop a pillar he had thrown into the air, landing exactly where he intended, at whatever distance he required. He wore elaborate robes and moved with a slow, deliberate arrogance that communicated he had never once been surprised by anything that happened in a fight. He killed with his tongue. He dispatched General Blue with a single strike. And when Goku's father, the memory of Grandpa Gohan, stood between Tao and his mission, Tao killed him without hesitation. Bora, a powerful warrior who had been protecting his son Upa in the wilderness, was gone in moments. Upa was Bora's young son, a small child left alone in the wilderness after his father's murder. Goku made him a promise before leaving to face the Red Ribbon Army at their headquarters. He promised that he would collect all 7 Dragon Balls and bring Bora back. It was a promise made without ceremony, offered to a grieving child by a boy who understood grief himself. Goku carried that promise through every confrontation that followed. When he finally stood before Shenron with all 7 Dragon Balls gathered, the wish he made was not for himself. It was for Upa. This moment was one of the clearest expressions of who Goku was. Not ambitious, not strategic, but utterly faithful to the people he cared about. Goku's assault on the Red Ribbon Army headquarters was not a coordinated military operation. It was a single boy walking into an army. He dismantled their outer defenses, passed through their gates, defeated their soldiers, and reached Commander Black, now piloting a massive mechanized battlesuit, entirely alone. The sequence was played not as a heroic charge, but as something quieter and more inexorable. Goku was not angry. He was not performing. He simply kept moving forward, and nothing the army could do was enough to stop him. The dismantling of the Red Ribbon Army by one child was the moment Dragon Ball Classic first showed the full scope of what Goku was capable of. The fortune teller Baba Saga followed the Red Ribbon Army arc without pause, sliding from one kind of story into something more personal and unexpected. Goku needed the location of the final Dragon Ball to fulfill his promise to Upa, and fortune teller Baba, the older sister of Master Roshi, was the only one who could tell him where it was. She charged not money, but the defeat of 5 consecutive fighters. What followed was an unusual tournament, staged not in a bright arena, but in a dim castle surrounded by a moat of water, presided over by an eccentric old woman on a crystal ball. Fortune teller Baba's fighters were strange and varied. One of them was a vampire-like being with unusual powers. Another was a mummy wrapped in bandages, whose strength exceeded anything Goku and Yamcha had faced from ordinary opponents. Each fight required a different kind of thinking, a different approach. So, what does this instinct is now offer? You are offering you this knowledge as is it something that probably individually required to do and required to not have them and attempted, and this variety kept the saga feeling fresh rather than repetitive, as though each encounter were its own small story within the larger one. The matches at Baba's palace had a carnival quality to them, dreamlike and slightly eerie, and this atmosphere set them apart from every other combat sequence in the classic era. The fifth and final fighter at Baba's palace was kept hidden until the moment of the match, and when Goku stepped onto the platform and looked at his opponent, he felt something he could not name. The fighter moved like someone Goku knew. The way he stood, the way he breathed, the rhythm of his footwork, all of it was achingly familiar. The fighter was the revived spirit of Grandpa Gohan, brought back for one day by Baba's power to walk among the living. Goku did not know this. The rules prevented Gohan from identifying himself, but the body remembered what the mind could not confirm, and Goku fought with a tenderness he had never shown in any previous match. The reunion was heartbreaking in the quiet way that Dragon Ball Classic handled its most emotional moments, without music swells, without grand speeches, without explicit sentimentality. Gohan could not say he was Gohan, and Goku could not say what he felt. But when the match ended, and Gohan turned to go, Goku said aloud that the man had smelled like Grandpa Gohan. He said it simply, as an observation. And that was all. The spirit departed. Goku stood alone. And for a moment, the series stopped being an adventure story and became something quieter and more personal. A boy who missed his grandfather in a world full of wonders, still carrying that one small grief. The 22nd Tenkaichi Budokai arrived 3 years after the first, and with it came the introduction of two characters who would significantly reshape the world of Dragon Ball Classic. Tien Shinhan was a student of the Crane School, the rival tradition to Master Roshi's Turtle School. He was tall, muscular, and extraordinarily skilled. He had a third eye in the center of his forehead, said to provide heightened perception and a more complete awareness of his surroundings. His approach to fighting was precise and calculating, guided by the philosophy of Master Shen, the Crane Hermit, who taught that an opponent's destruction was more important than personal honor. Chiaotzu was Tien's constant companion, a small, round-faced being with painted cheeks and a floating, ghostly quality to his movements. His appearance drew from the Jiangxi, the hopping vampires of Chinese folklore, and he possessed telekinetic abilities that made him dangerous despite his fragile appearance. He and Tien were bound by something deeper than training. They were bound by years of shared experience, by a loyalty that predated their arrival at the tournament and would outlast every conflict they faced together. Chiaotzu's quiet devotion to Tien was one of the secondary emotional threads of the later classic arc, easy to overlook, but consistent and genuine. Master Shen, the Crane Hermit, had a history with Master Roshi that stretched back decades. They had trained together under the same master in their youth, and their philosophical divergence had turned a friendship into a slow and dignified rivalry. Shen believed that martial arts existed to destroy. Roshi believed they existed to protect and to grow. This fundamental disagreement colored everything their schools produced. Tien carried Shen's philosophy into the tournament, and it showed in the way he fought, efficiently, coldly, without mercy. His early confrontations with the protagonists were uncomfortable precisely because he was not wrong about his own skills. He was simply pursuing them toward the wrong end. The 22nd Budokai final between Goku and Tien was one of the longest and most evenly matched fights in the classic era. Both fighters had grown considerably since the last tournament. Tien used his tri-beam technique, the Kikoho, an enormously powerful energy blast that consumed the user's own life force in proportion to its strength. He used the solar flare to temporarily blind his opponent. He used his third eye to track Goku's movements, and Goku pushed back with everything he had developed across 3 years of constant training. In the end, the match was decided by an extraordinary accident. Goku, poised to land the decisive blow, was struck by a pellet from a rifle held by Master Shen's student in the audience, and stumbled just enough to lose the final exchange. Goku lost the 22nd Budokai to Tien Shinhan by the narrowest of margins under the most frustrating of circumstances. The rules of the tournament were clear. The first fighter to touch the ground outside the ring was the loser, or the first to be unable to continue. Goku fell outside the ring, striking a car on the road below after a tremendous aerial collision. He had not been defeated in the conventional sense. He had simply landed in the wrong place. The loss carried the same quality as his loss to Jackie Chun: instructive, clarifying fuel for what would come next. But this time, there was a heaviness beneath the result, a sense that the world around the tournament was becoming more complicated and more dangerous. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off. And tell me what time it is where you're watching from. It came not during a tournament, not in a grand battle, but quietly, suddenly, outside the arena after the 22nd Budokai had ended. A strange creature, monstrous and bird-like, a servant of a force none of them had yet encountered, descended and took Krillin's life without warning, without ceremony, and without any of the narrative preparations that might have softened the blow. For those who had followed the series from the beginning, it was a shock unlike anything the story had previously attempted. Dragon Ball had always been adventurous and occasionally dangerous, but it had never done this. It had never simply taken someone. The creature who killed Krillin was called Tambourine, and he was a demon child spawned by Demon King Piccolo, Piccolo Daimao. The king had been sealed in a rice cooker decades before the story began, imprisoned there by a dying technique called the evil containment wave, or Mafuba, created by a martial arts master named Mutaito. Mutaito had been Master Roshi's teacher, one generation removed from the living tradition of the turtle school. He had invented the Mafuba, specifically because no technique of normal combat could defeat Piccolo Daimao. The sealing had cost Mutaito his life, and even then it had been only a containment, not a destruction. Piccolo had waited inside his prison for centuries, patient and undiminished. Piccolo Daimao's release into the story brought a different quality of threat than anything Dragon Ball Classic had previously explored. He was not ambitious in the Pilaf way, not militaristic in the Red Ribbon Army way. He was ancient and deliberate, a being of pure destructive will who remembered exactly what the world had done to him and intended to repay every moment of that imprisonment. He spawned his demon children to carry out his will. Tambourine hunted down and killed former tournament fighters one by one, eliminating any potential resistance before it could organize. The methodical brutality of this campaign was something new in the series' emotional register. Goku's grief at Krillin's death was not expressed in long speeches or dramatic declarations. It was expressed in a single thing: pure, consuming rage that bypassed every conventional limit his body had known. He found Tambourine and fought him with a ferocity that made his previous bouts look gentle. He destroyed Tambourine completely, and then he turned toward the source, toward Piccolo Daimao himself, and flew straight at a being who had casually murdered hundreds without effort. This was Goku running on instinct, on love converted into fury, on the refusal to let grief simply sit inside him while its cause still walked the world. Piccolo Daimao was not defeated in that first encounter. He defeated Goku so thoroughly that Goku lay broken on the ground, barely alive. Every bone that could break had been broken. The injuries were catalogued carefully in the narrative, not for shock value but to establish the honest scale of the gap between them. Goku survived only because Yajirobe, a solitary, food-obsessed swordsman who had been nearby and chose survival over confrontation, brought him away from the battlefield and kept him alive long enough for help to arrive. Yajirobe's presence in this moment was one of the quiet coincidences of Dragon Ball Classic, the way ordinary people sometimes appear at the exact instant when their ordinary choices make an extraordinary difference. Korin Tower stood on a single pillar of rock so tall that its summit disappeared into the clouds. Master Roshi had once climbed it, and it had taken him 3 years of continuous effort to reach the top. Goku, broken and barely mobile, climbed it in a fraction of that time, driven by something beyond his physical capability, beyond any reasonable accounting of what his wounded body should have been able to do. At the summit, Korin, an ancient white cat who had guarded the sacred water for 300 years, watched Goku arrive. The sacred water, Korin explained, was a liquid of immense power that could either kill the one who drank it or unlock something dormant within them. Goku drank it, And he survived. The ultra-divine water was a poison. This was not a metaphor or an approximation. It was a poison that had killed every previous person who had attempted to drink it. Its power to unlock potential was real, but it demanded everything in return, not strength or training time, but the willingness to die in pursuit of becoming. Goku's survival was not guaranteed. It was possible only because of what had already been built inside him through years of living, loving, training, and losing. The water found something in him and amplified it. And when he descended Korin Tower again, he was not the same person who had climbed it. Piccolo Daimao, meanwhile, had used the Dragon Balls to restore his youth. He had summoned Shenron, made his wish, and then, in a final act of cruelty, killed the dragon itself. He destroyed Shenron to prevent any future use of the Dragon Balls against him. A dragon that had existed since the Guardian of Earth created the universe's most powerful wishing artifact was simply gone, dispatched as a precaution, a resource eliminated once it had served its purpose. The casual completeness of this act said everything necessary about Piccolo Daimao's relationship to the world. It existed to serve his will, and anything that could not serve it or might oppose it was simply removed. Goku's second confrontation with Piccolo Daimao was a different kind of fight. The power gap had not simply closed. The fight was now between equals who were exploring their equality in real time, neither sure of the other's limit until they reached it. Goku used every technique he possessed. He fought in the air, on the ground, at close range and at distance. He absorbed damage that should have ended him and kept going. And in the final exchange, he drove his fist through Piccolo Daimao's chest from below, launching himself upward through the rubble of the battlefield through the air, with all of his remaining strength concentrated in a single point. Piccolo Daimao fell, and with his last moment, he released one final act into the world, an egg, carrying everything he was into the next generation. Piccolo Jr. would not be born until later, but the egg was the promise of continuation, a thread that Piccolo Daimao had attached to the future before leaving it. He had accepted his defeat, but refused the ending. And so Dragon Ball Classic, which might have closed with that battle, instead opened another door, leading forward into the 3 years that would follow, into the training that would shape Goku into the person he needed to become, and into the last great tournament of the original series. After defeating Piccolo Daimao, Goku did not return to the life he had known before. He traveled upward, quite literally, ascending to Kami's Lookout, the sacred platform that floated above the clouds, above Korin Tower, above everything that could be seen from the Earth's surface. Kami, the guardian of Earth, lived here with his ancient assistant, Mr. Popo, tending to the spiritual health of the world in solitude. Kami's Lookout was not simply a training ground, it was a threshold, a place between the terrestrial and something older and quieter, where time moved differently and the distractions of ordinary life could not follow. Mr. Popo had been at the lookout for hundreds of years. He was patient in the way that only beings who have measured time in centuries could be patient. Not resigned, but genuinely unhurried, as though the world's urgency had simply never been able to touch him. He began Goku's training not with physical challenges, but with a lesson in perception. He blindfolded Goku and told him to fight using nothing but his senses, his awareness of ki, the subtle pressure of another being's presence in space. This was a different kind of knowing than the one Goku had been developing. It was interior, careful, built from the inside out, rather than through impact and repetition. Kami himself was a mystery that Dragon Ball Classic left partially open by design. He was the guardian of Earth. He had created the Dragon Balls as gifts to the people he was charged with protecting. And he was, in some deep structural sense, connected to Piccolo Daimao in a way that neither of them could fully articulate within the confines of the original series. What could be observed was that Kami was old and careful and slightly sad, the way beings often become when they have watched the world long enough to understand how much it can lose. He agreed to train Goku, and he did so knowing that the training would produce someone capable of defeating the reincarnation of the other half of himself. Kami and Piccolo Daimao had once been one being, a young Namekian, though Namekians were not yet named as such within Dragon Ball Classic, had arrived on Earth long ago, carrying within him both deep goodness and something darker that could not be reconciled. He had wanted to become the guardian of Earth, but the keeper of the title had sensed the evil within him and refused, and so the Namekian had separated himself, casting out the dark half, and became Kami through that act of purification. The cast-out darkness had taken form as Piccolo Daimao, two halves of one person, living separate lives, moving through the world on paths that would eventually and inevitably converge in the body of a child. Goku trained at the Lookout for 3 years. He did not emerge for tournaments or visits or adventures. He stayed and worked with a focused patience that was new to him. The playfulness remained, it was not trained out of him, but it was joined now by something deeper, a quiet seriousness about the gap between where he was and where he needed to be. He was preparing for the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai, and he knew, without being told directly, that the final match of that tournament would determine something larger than a trophy or a title. It would determine whether the threat that Piccolo Daimao had placed in the world with his dying breath could be answered. Piccolo Jr. had spent those same 3 years in his own kind of preparation. He had hatched from the egg his predecessor had released, and he had grown rapidly, carrying within him all of Piccolo Daimao's memories, all of his hatred, all of his knowledge of techniques and strategy, and the vulnerabilities of everyone who had ever opposed his lineage. He entered the 23rd Budokai under the name Ma Jr., keeping himself obscured until the moment he chose to reveal himself. He was patient in the way that someone is patient when they have already decided the outcome and are simply waiting for the ceremony of arrival. The 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai was the culminating event of Dragon Ball Classic. It gathered together threads from across the entire story, old characters returning, new rivalries being settled, promises made years earlier being kept or broken. Chi-Chi arrived as a competitor. Years before, when she and Goku had been children on Fire Mountain, Goku had half-accidentally promised to marry her, not understanding at the time what marriage was, thinking it was a kind of food or perhaps a technique. Chi-Chi had taken the promise seriously, had trained for years, and had come to the tournament intending to hold him to it. She won her early matches with impressive skill and eventually faced Goku in the semi-finals. The match between Goku and Chi-Chi was brief but affectionate. Chi-Chi was genuinely skilled, formidable enough to reach the final rounds of the world's greatest tournament, and she fought with complete seriousness. Goku faced her with the same respect he showed every opponent, but when the match ended and Chi-Chi tearfully reminded him of his promise, Goku agreed without hesitation. He did not agree out of social pressure or obligation. He agreed because it seemed right and because he valued Chi-Chi. He proposed to her in front of the assembled crowd of the tournament in the most straightforward way he had ever proposed anything. Chi-Chi burst into tears of relief. The Ox King, her father, and an old student of Master Roshi cheered from somewhere in the stands. Piccolo Jr. moved through his bracket with efficiency, revealing himself and dispensing with any pretense of disguise at a moment that served him best. When the two finalists had been determined and Piccolo Jr. stood across the ring from Goku, the crowd understood that something different was happening. This was not a tournament final in the ordinary sense. This was the completion of something that had begun with a sealed rice cooker and a dying technique and a promise made across centuries of hatred. The arena itself seemed to hold its breath. The final match was the longest and most detailed combat in all of Dragon Ball Classic. Piccolo Jr. demonstrated techniques and abilities that exceeded everything his predecessor had shown. He regenerated limbs. He expanded his body to enormous size, becoming a giant that towered over the arena and could flatten opponents through sheer mass. He used the evil containment wave, the Mafuba, that Tien Shinhan had attempted earlier in the tournament, turning the technique that had once imprisoned his predecessor into a weapon against the man who had spent 3 years at Kami's Lookout. He was not simply powerful, he was prepared, methodical, and deeply intelligent about the fight in front of him. Goku matched him, not through any single technique or revelation, but through the accumulated truth of everything he had built across 3 years. The interior awareness Mr. Popo had given him, the patience Kami had cultivated, the physical foundations that Roshi's milk runs had built years before, the grief that had driven him up Korin Tower, the love that had made the ultra-divine water survivable. He matched Piccolo Jr. in the sky, on the ground, in close range and at a distance. And when the decisive moment arrived, when Piccolo Jr. lay in the rubble of the arena, broken and unable to continue, Goku walked toward him not with a finishing blow, but with a senzu bean. He placed the bean beside Piccolo Jr. and stepped back. He did not explain himself. He offered no speech about redemption or mercy or the future. He simply left it there as he had once left a promise beside a grieving child in the wilderness. This was the final and most characteristic act of Goku in Dragon Ball Classic. Not a victory pose, not a declaration of supremacy, but a small gesture of care towards someone who had just tried to kill him. Because Goku believed the world was larger and more possible than its worst moments, and he wanted Piccolo to be part of what came next. Piccolo Jr. walked away from the arena alone. He did not speak. He did not thank Goku. He simply took the bean, took the acknowledgement of what it meant, and disappeared into the sky. Where he went, and what he thought, in those first hours of a future he had not expected, would not be revealed in Dragon Ball Classic. But the seed had been planted in the quiet way that all of the most important things in this series were planted, without announcement, without ceremony, simply placed there in the world and left to grow. The world of Dragon Ball Classic was built from an enormous number of specific and unusual details, and many of them accumulated over the series run in ways that were easy to overlook. The flying cloud, the nimbus or kantoon, had been given to Goku by Master Roshi after Goku found and returned a sea turtle to the ocean. The turtle had been stranded far from its home, and Goku and Bulma had helped it reach the sea. Roshi, in gratitude, offered a gift. He had originally intended to ride the nimbus himself, but was unable to. The cloud could only be ridden by those with a pure heart, and Roshi's heart, however generous in many respects, did not qualify. Goku was on the cloud before the offer was fully made. The power pole, Goku's extending staff, could reach from Earth to Korin Tower and beyond. It had been given to Grandpa Gohan as a gift from Korin himself, passed down as something between a tool and a symbol. When Goku eventually climbed Korin Tower in person and met the ancient cat at its summit, the power pole became a bridge between the two places, an anchor of continuity in a story that was constantly moving forward. The staff was eventually left behind when Goku ascended to Kami's lookout, not because it was no longer useful, but because he had grown beyond the need for it in the same way a river eventually grows beyond its banks. The relationship between Kami's lookout and Korin Tower was architectural as well as symbolic. The tower stood directly below the lookout, connecting the ordinary world of the Earth's surface to the elevated platform above the clouds. Climbing the tower was the prerequisite to ascending further. This vertical geography gave the Dragon Ball world a quiet sense of spiritual hierarchy, not rigid or oppressive, but present, a suggestion that some things could only be reached by first reaching other things. Goku's journey upward through the three locations, the surface world, Korin's tower, Kami's platform, traced a kind of inner arc that paralleled his outer development. Yajirobe occupied a unique position in Dragon Ball Classic. He was introduced as a skilled swordsman who lived entirely alone in a wilderness region, hunting and eating whatever he found. He had no ambitions, no alliances, and no interest in the large events unfolding around him, except insofar as they intersected with his immediate needs. He had defeated Symbol, one of Piccolo Daimao's demon spawn, by simply cutting him down with his sword and then eating him, because Symbol was large and Yajirobe was hungry. This sequence was played for comedy but also established something real about Yajirobe. He was capable, genuinely capable, in a completely ordinary and untheatrical way. Yajirobe's contribution during the King Piccolo arc was indirect but essential. He did not fight Piccolo Daimao. He explicitly refused to fight Piccolo Daimao, but he found Goku's broken body after the initial defeat, kept him alive, and eventually brought him a senzu bean that allowed recovery to begin. Without that senzu bean, the story ended there. There was no journey to Korin Tower, no ultra-divine water, no rematch, no Goku driving his fist through Piccolo Daimo's chest. There is simply a boy and the rebel. Yajirobe's unwillingness to be a hero was paradoxically one of the most heroic things anyone did in the arc. Senzu beans first appeared during Goku's recovery from his battle with Piccolo Daimao, given to him by Korin. A single bean could restore fighters' strength, heal their injuries, and replenish their energy completely. Korin grew them in small quantities. They were difficult to cultivate and the crop was always modest. Their scarcity was part of what made them feel precious, rather than trivial. When a senzu bean was given to someone in Dragon Ball Classic, it was not a casual act. It was a resource being deployed, a choice being made, a form of care made tangible. The last senzu bean in the series, placed beside a defeated Piccolo Jr. by the man who had just beaten him, carried all of that accumulated weight with it. Dragon Ball Classic introduced a number of techniques that would become pillars of the franchise's combat vocabulary, and many of them arrived with histories that were far richer than their in-story debuts suggested. The Dodonpa, or Dodon Rei, was the signature technique of the Crane School. It was a concentrated beam of ki, fired from a single finger, taught by Master Shen to his students. Chiaotzu used it against Krillin during the 22nd Budokai, in a match that was contentious and unsatisfying for both of them. Tien used a variation of it in his earlier career before developing more powerful techniques. The Dodonpa represented a philosophy of ki use, concentrated, precise, intended to penetrate rather than overwhelm. The solar flare, Taioken, was invented by Tien Shinhan and made its first appearance during the 22nd Budokai. It was not a damaging technique in itself. It produced a blinding flash of light that temporarily robbed opponents of their sight, creating an opening that a skilled fighter could exploit. What made the solar flare remarkable was its subsequent adoption by other characters. Goku, Krillin, and others would use it across Dragon Ball Z and beyond. A technique invented by a character in Dragon Ball Classic, by a person who had been introduced as an antagonist, became a standard tool in the franchise's arsenal. This quiet continuity was one of Dragon Ball's underappreciated gifts to its own world. The Tri-Beam Kikoho was presented as potentially the most powerful technique in Dragon Ball Classic. It required enormous concentration and physical cost. It consumed the user's own life force in direct proportion to its power output, meaning that the more desperately it was needed, the more dangerous it was to use. Tien first used it in the 22nd Budokai against Goku, and the effort left him visibly drained. He would use it again in the 23rd Budokai against Piccolo Jr., channeling everything he had into a technique that severely damaged Piccolo despite not defeating him. The Tri-Beam was not a finishing move. It was a statement of commitment, a technique that said, "I am willing to spend everything I have here." The evil containment wave, Mafuba, occupied a special place in Dragon Ball Classic's mythology. It was the only technique ever developed that could capture a being like Piccolo Daimao rather than simply destroying him. And destroying him was, for most of the series, beyond any available power. Mutaito, the teacher of Master Roshi and the Crane Hermit, died creating and using it. Roshi attempted it against Piccolo Daimao and died from the effort. Tien learned it from a scroll and used it during the 23rd Budokai, and while the technique was intercepted before it succeeded, it was still powerful enough to disrupt Piccolo Jr. significantly. The Mafuba was a technique built from sacrifice, and every time it appeared, the cost was clear. The production history of Dragon Ball Classic contained its own quiet accumulation of details. The anime adaptation of Dragon Ball premiered on Fuji TV in Japan on February 26, 1986, more than a year after the manga had begun. The gap allowed the manga to build a readership first, and the anime arrived to an audience that was already invested in the story's characters and world. This sequencing was not always the case with manga adaptations, and it contributed to the anime's strong debut. The original opening theme for the Dragon Ball anime was Maka Fushigi Adventure, sung by Hiroki Takahashi. The song had an energy and brightness that matched the series' early tone perfectly, something between a lullaby and a call to action, unhurried and warm. The ending theme, Romantic Ageruyo, became one of the most recognizable pieces of music in the franchise's history. These two songs defined the sonic atmosphere of Dragon Ball Classic for a generation of viewers, and their reuse in later anniversary productions reliably produced a specific kind of nostalgic response in longtime fans. Masako Nozawa voiced Goku in the original Japanese anime and has continued to do so for the entire span of the franchise. This consistency, a single performer giving voice to the same character across more than 4 decades, is nearly without parallel in animation. She also voiced Gohan and Goten in Dragon Ball Z, and later Bardock and other Saiyan characters, lending all of Goku's family a connective thread through her performance. Her voice for young Goku in Dragon Ball Classic had a particular quality, bright, clear, slightly rough at the edges, that communicated the character's physical wildness and emotional openness simultaneously. The Dragon Ball anime occasionally expanded on its source material through filler episodes, sequences not present in the manga, written specifically for the animated series. Some of these filler arcs were brief, filling gaps between story beats, others extended characters' journeys, or added side adventures to slow the adaptation's pace relative to the manga's faster storytelling. These filler sequences varied in quality, but the best of them honored the spirit of the original material and gave secondary characters time that the manga had not provided them. They are remembered with varying degrees of affection by fans, depending on which ones a viewer encountered first. Toriyama supervised the manga closely but was less involved in day-to-day decisions about the anime. This meant that the animated series occasionally diverged from his intentions in small ways, and some character interpretations shifted in the translation from page to screen. The voice acting added dimensions that the drawings alone could not provide, and in many cases, these additions became canonical in the emotional sense. The way a character sounded in a particular moment became inseparable from how fans understood the character. This collaborative, somewhat distributed form of authorship is common to long-running franchise animation, and Dragon Ball Classic was one of the earliest and most influential examples of it. The cultural impact of Dragon Ball Classic is impossible to fully account for in a single sitting, but certain elements of it are worth pausing over. The series arrived in a moment when action-adventure manga was reshaping what readers expected from the medium. It sat alongside other transformative works of the same era in Weekly Shonen Jump, and the competition among those series drove all of them toward greater ambition. Dragon Ball's consistent popularity influenced how other creators approached the genre, the pacing of fights, the importance of character relationships to action sequences, the use of training arcs to justify power escalation. All of these became conventions of shonen manga in part because Dragon Ball established them so definitively. Toriyama's visual style was itself enormously influential. The clean, readable character designs, the dynamic but uncluttered action sequences, the way backgrounds balanced detail and emptiness, all of these became reference points for subsequent generations of manga artists who grew up reading Dragon Ball. The series was one of the first to demonstrate how thoroughly a single artist's visual vocabulary could define an entire genre's aesthetic. Artists who cited Dragon Ball as an influence include creators of some of the most commercially successful manga series of the past 30 years, and the chain of influence has not stopped. The English-language history of Dragon Ball Classic is long, complicated, and worth noting. The original Dragon Ball anime was first dubbed into English by a company called Harmony Gold in the late 1980s, but this version was heavily altered and saw very limited distribution. A more complete translation was produced in later years, but Dragon Ball Classic remained less known in Western markets than Dragon Ball Z for quite some time, partly because Dragon Ball Z aired first in many regions. This reversal of the original order meant that many Western fans came to Dragon Ball Classic already knowing where its story would eventually lead, encountering Goku's childhood with the knowledge of the adult he would become. The experience of watching Dragon Ball Classic with that prior knowledge is fundamentally different from watching it as it was originally intended to be watched. Knowing that the small, earnest boy on the Nimbus would one day become someone capable of protecting entire planets does not diminish the classic era. It adds a particular tenderness to it. Every moment of Goku not knowing something, every moment of Goku being surprised by the world's size, every moment of Goku laughing at something simple, all of these become more precious when viewed through the lens of what comes later. Dragon Ball Classic is both a complete story and a prologue, and it works beautifully as both. The naming traditions of Dragon Ball Classic are one of its most delightful hidden architectures. Toriyama built entire categories of wordplay into his character names, and once you know the system, it becomes impossible to encounter a new character without quietly wondering which category they belong to. Bulma and her family carried names derived from underwear and clothing. Oolong, Puar, and other characters bore the names of various types of tea. The members of the Red Ribbon Army were named after colors: red, black, blue, white, silver, violet. The demon children of Piccolo de Mao carried musical instrument names: piano, tambourine, cymbal, drum. And later, as the Saiyan lineage expanded in Dragon Ball Z, their names would be found in vegetable words. This layering of thematic wordplay gave the Dragon Ball world a coherent internal logic that felt like craft rather than accident. Toriyama himself was deeply fond of these naming games and spoke about them with mild amusement in interviews. He said that the name Kamehameha had come to him after his wife, who was fond of Hawaiian history, mentioned the name of the Hawaiian king. The sound pleased him immediately. He felt it had the right weight for an attack, syllables that built on each other in a satisfying rhythm, that took effort to speak correctly, that sounded like something arriving. He committed to it, and it became, in time, the most recognizable fictional technique name in the world. The story of how it came to be is characteristic of how Toriyama worked, casually following what sounded right, trusting his instincts about language and sound more than any formal consideration. The landscape of Dragon Ball Classic was not modeled on any single real place, but drew from a mixture of visual influences and cultural references that gave it a distinctive geography. Desert regions that recalled the Gobi stretched across parts of the world. Mountains that suggested Chinese watercolor paintings rose in other areas. Tropical forests and ocean islands provided contrast. The Capsule Corporation's headquarters in the western capital looked unmistakably modern, while Koren Tower and the lands around it suggested something between Southeast Asian temples and the bamboo forests of classic Chinese art. This visual layering produced a world that felt simultaneously familiar and invented, rooted in the real world without being constrained by it. The weather of the Dragon Ball world was largely a narrative device, present when the story needed it and absent when it did not. The full moon was perhaps the most consequential meteorological event in Dragon Ball Classic, responsible for Goku's transformation into the Great Ape on several significant occasions. The first of these was the night Goku accidentally killed Grandpa Gohan, a fact revealed only through later flashbacks, discovered by Goku with grief rather than relief. The second was during the 21st Tenkaichi Budokai, when Roshi destroyed the moon to prevent Goku's transformation from ending the tournament prematurely. This detail, that Master Roshi simply destroyed the moon because it was causing a problem, was one of the earliest signals that Dragon Ball's sense of scale was very different from ordinary life. The moon's destruction during the 21st Budokai was handled with remarkable casualness. Roshi fired a Kamehameha at the moon, it exploded, and Goku's tail was cut to end the transformation. The tournament continued. No one in the arena appears to have processed the enormity of what had just happened. This was characteristic of Dragon Ball Classic's relationship to cosmic scale. Events that would, in any realistic sense, be catastrophically significant were absorbed by the story's momentum and the character's practical orientation. The world had been saved. There was a match to complete. Move on. Among the most emotionally resonant secondary characters in Dragon Ball Classic was Nam, the desert fighter who competed in the 21st Tenkaichi Budokai with the weight of his dying village behind him. His presence in the tournament was brief. He advanced through several rounds before being eliminated, but every moment of it was charged with a specific kind of quiet desperation. He was not there for glory. He was not there because he loved fighting. He was there because the prize money was the only practical means available to him of saving the people he came from. This specificity of motivation gave Nam a depth that most tournament entrants in any sports story rarely possess. The resolution of Nam's story came not from the tournament, but from Bulma's generosity. She approached him after his elimination and, understanding his situation, provided him with a hoi poi capsule containing a device that could provide his village with water. This small act, performed without ceremony by a character who had been introduced primarily for comedy and as Goku's early companion, demonstrated something that Dragon Ball Classic did consistently and without fanfare. The world it depicted was one where people helped each other when they could, where the protagonist's orbit included human goodness that was not reserved for dramatic moments. Bulma's gift to Nam cost her nothing and meant everything to him, and the series simply noted it and moved on. The tournament saga's secondary fighters formed a gallery of personalities that lingered in the memory precisely because they were distinct without being elaborate. Bacterian, the unwashed fighter who weaponized his smell, was pure absurdist comedy, a joke that worked because the series committed to it entirely and because the resolution, Krillin realizing he had no nose to be offended by, was earned through character detail rather than convenience. Guran, the reptilian creature with the merry-go-round gum, was visually memorable and mechanically interesting, his adhesive substance creating a constraint that forced Goku to find a solution rather than simply overpower him. These early tournament fighters were not deep characters, but they were vivid ones, and the world felt richer for having them in it. The Red Ribbon Army arc contained moments of genuine warmth alongside its military conflict. Android 8, Ater, as Goku called him, was the most affecting of these. He had been built as a weapon, engineered for obedience and combat, but somewhere in his construction something had gone wrong or gone right, depending on one's perspective. He could not bring himself to hurt people. He refused orders to harm Goku when they first met, and instead helped him navigate Muscle Tower. He was gentle with children, he was disturbed by cruelty. He was, in every meaningful sense, a person, and the story treated him as one. Goku's easy acceptance of Android 8 was characteristic. He did not require the android to justify his goodness or prove his loyalty. He simply recognized it, named it with a nickname, and proceeded on the assumption that Ater was his friend. This quality of Goku's, the immediate, uncomplicated trust he extended to anyone who demonstrated genuine goodness, was not naivety in the story's framing. It was a kind of clarity. Goku was not easily deceived because his perception of character was direct rather than analytical. He felt who people were rather than reasoning about it, and he was right far more often than he was wrong. General White's defeat and the liberation of Muscle Tower was a moment with two distinct registers. On one level, it was a straightforward triumph. The good defeated the bad, the imprisoned were freed, the tower's menace ended. On another level, it raised a question the series did not fully answer but left visible. What happened to the people who had been part of these organizations? The soldiers, the administrators, the scientists who built the androids. The Red Ribbon Army was enormous, global, and heavily staffed. Goku dismantled its headquarters, but the world that had produced it remained unchanged. This was not a flaw in Dragon Ball Classic. It was simply the honest shape of the adventure genre, personal victories in a world that continued on its own terms. Mercenary Tao's eventual fate in Dragon Ball Classic was one of the stranger threads of the later arcs. Having been defeated and nearly killed by Goku, who redirected Tao's own grenade back at him with his power pole, Tao survived and was rebuilt with cybernetic enhancements, returning as Cyborg Tao in the 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai arc. His return was handled with a mixture of menace and black comedy, the rebuilt assassin now trading on reputation more than current ability. He was defeated again, this time more definitively, by a more mature and considerably more powerful Tien Shinhan. The arc of Tao across Dragon Ball Classic, from near-invincible killer to defeated cyborg, traced the same general pattern as many of the series' villains, formidable in their moment, diminished by the world's continued growth around them. The fortune teller Baba arc explored, in its quiet way, the metaphysics of death in the Dragon Ball world. The dead could be brought back by the Dragon Balls. They could, under specific circumstances, be visited in the realm of the living for limited periods, as Grandpa Gohan's appearance demonstrated. They existed somewhere. The nature of that somewhere was left impressionistic rather than defined in Dragon Ball Classic, and they were not entirely beyond reach. This permeability between the living and the dead was one of Dragon Ball's distinctive world-building choices, and it had consequences that accumulated across the franchise's history. Grandpa Gohan's appearance at Baba's palace was not the series' first engagement with the dead, but it was the most personal. The emotional register of the encounter was entirely different from anything the series had attempted before. There was no battle at stake, no villain to defeat, no objective to achieve. There was just a boy who had lost his grandfather and a man who had come back for one day and could not say who he was. The economy of the scene, how much it communicated through the absence of communication, was a testament to how well Toriyama understood the characters he had built. He did not need to write the grief. It was already inside the reader, accumulated across the chapters that had come before. Launch was one of Dragon Ball Classic's most unusual characters, and her trajectory across the series was one of its stranger, undocumented stories. She had two personalities, a gentle, blue-haired version who sneezed and became a violent, blonde gunwoman, and the violent, blonde gunwoman who sneezed and became a gentle, blue-haired woman. The two versions had no memory of each other's actions. The mechanic was played for comedy, and it worked because both personalities were written with internal consistency. The gentle Launch was genuinely sweet, and the blonde Launch was genuinely dangerous, and the sneezing was always unexpected. She appeared regularly through Dragon Ball Classic, attached loosely to the main cast, living with Roshi for a time and accompanying the group on various occasions. Toriyama famously admitted during the Dragon Ball Z era that he had simply forgotten Launch existed. She appeared in the early episodes of Dragon Ball Z briefly and then disappeared, and Toriyama acknowledged in an interview that he had not thought about her while writing the later story. This admission became a gentle piece of Dragon Ball mythology, the character who was so thoroughly herself that even her creator could misplace her. Launch appeared in a few subsequent occasions in non-canonical bonus materials and was referenced affectionately by fans as the embodiment of a character from an earlier, lighter era who had not quite made the transition to the more serious tone that followed. The philosophical dialogue between the Turtle School and the Crane School ran through the Tenkaichi Budokai arcs as a subtext that enriched the tournament fights without overwhelming them. Master Roshi and Master Shen had trained together in their youth under the same instructor, and their divergence had been gradual. Roshi believed that martial arts were for protection, for growth, for the development of the human spirit alongside the body. Shen believed they were for domination, that the purpose of superior skill was to exercise it over those who lacked it. Neither master was without flaws, but the series made its alignment clear through the outcomes of their teachings. Tien began as an embodiment of the Crane School philosophy and ended Dragon Ball Classic as something more complicated and more interesting. His defeat of Goku in the 22nd Budokai was achieved partly through external interference. His association with the Crane School's dirty tactics, his growing discomfort with those tactics, his eventual rejection of Master Shen's explicit instruction during the tournament, and his genuine respect for Goku that developed across their rivalry traced a character arc that was quiet and unhurried and entirely convincing. By the 23rd Budokai, Tien was no longer a student of Master Shen in any meaningful sense. He was his own person, shaped by his training but not defined by it. Chiaotzu's role in this evolution was primarily one of witness and reflection. He was devoted to Tien in a way that was complete and uncomplicated, following him across the transition from Crane School student to independent fighter without requiring explanation or justification. Their bond was one of the most stable relationships in Dragon Ball Classic, and its stability was part of what made it poignant. In a story full of growth and change, Chiaotzu's loyalty was a constant, a reminder that some connections persist through transformation without needing to transform themselves. The production of Dragon Ball Classic intersected with a broader moment in Japanese popular culture that gave it particular significance. The mid-1980s were a period of creative ferment in manga and animation in Japan, with multiple landmark series appearing in close succession. Dragon Ball was published alongside other titles in Weekly Shonen Jump that would also go on to define the medium for decades. The competition within those pages drove each series to take creative risks, to develop their stories faster and more daringly than they might have in a less competitive environment. Dragon Ball benefited from this pressure in ways both visible and invisible. Toriyama's relationship with his editor, Kazuhiko Torishima, was an important part of the early Dragon Ball story. Torishima was famously demanding and critical, and his feedback shaped many of the series' early decisions. He initially found Goku's design too uncool and pushed Toriyama toward making the character more visually striking. Toriyama resisted some of these suggestions and incorporated others, and the tension between the artist's instincts and the editor's commercial sensibility produced a series that was both artistically distinctive and deeply readable. This kind of productive friction between creator and editor is common in the history of serialized manga, and Dragon Ball is one of its clearest examples. The serialized format of Dragon Ball Classic meant that the story was written under ongoing time pressure. A new chapter had to be completed every week, and Toriyama has spoken frankly about the exhaustion and stress that this schedule produced. The consistency of quality across the series, the visual energy, the comic timing, the emotional honesty, is all the more remarkable given these constraints. There were weeks when the art was simpler, and weeks when it was more detailed, and attentive readers can trace the rhythm of Toriyama's workload across the volumes, if they look carefully. But the story itself never felt like it was running on fumes. It always felt like it had somewhere to go. The transition from Dragon Ball Classic to Dragon Ball Z was not marked by a hard break in the original manga. The story simply continued, with the time skip after Goku and Chi-Chi's departure, followed by the introduction of their son Gohan, and the arrival of the Saiyans. What changed was the tone. Gradually, then all at once, the humor did not disappear entirely, but it retreated to the margins as the threat scales increased dramatically. The cosmic scope of Dragon Ball Z, its willingness to raise stakes to planetary and eventually universal levels, was made possible by the foundation Dragon Ball Classic had built. The world had been carefully populated, the rules had been quietly established, and the characters had been deeply enough developed that they could carry an entirely different kind of story. The 4-star Dragon Ball, the one Goku treasured above all others because it had belonged to his grandfather, was both a plot device and an emotional anchor. Its presence in the story reminded the reader at regular intervals that beneath the adventure and the fighting and the growing scale of conflict, there was a boy who had lost someone and kept a round piece of glass as his most important possession. This specific grief, not grand, not theatrical, just the ordinary human weight of missing someone, was part of what made Goku feel real rather than merely heroic. The Dragon Balls were collected and used multiple times across Dragon Ball Classic, each occasion serving a different narrative purpose. The first collection resolved the Emperor Pilaf arc through Oolong's absurd intervention. The second collection fulfilled Goku's promise to Upa by reviving Bora. The third collection came in the aftermath of the King Piccolo conflict, when the Dragon Balls were used to revive those who had been killed by Piccolo Daimao and his children. Each use was distinct in its emotional weight. The wish for underwear was comedy, the wish for Bora was the keeping of a promise. The wish to undo Piccolo's damage was the restoration of a world. The Dragon Balls served the story differently each time, precisely because the story was different each time. After each wish, the Dragon Balls scattered and turned to stone. This moment of dispersal was always a kind of ending. The goal was achieved, the immediate crisis resolved, and the objects of power were gone again, waiting to be found. The scatter was the world resetting, preparing for the next adventure. It was also a structural necessity. Without it, the Dragon Balls would have resolved every problem the moment they were assembled, and the story would have had no need to continue. The one-year cooling period was Toriyama's way of ensuring that the Dragon Balls were tools in the story rather than solutions to it. Among Dragon Ball Classic's contributions to the broader franchise was a set of secondary characters whose continuing presence across Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super gave them an unusual kind of longevity. Yamcha remained a fighter and a recurring presence, despite being repeatedly outpaced by the escalating power scales of later series. Tien Shinhan and Chiao Tzu appeared in every major saga, always fighting, always somewhat overmatched, but never absent. Krillin became one of the most important characters in Dragon Ball Z before returning to ordinary life in later arcs. These characters, introduced in Dragon Ball Classic as a boy's companions and rivals, grew old alongside the story and were treated with a consistency of affection that spoke well of both Toriyama and his editors. Master Roshi's continuing presence across the franchise was perhaps the most unexpected of the classic-era characters. In Dragon Ball Classic, he was the definitive martial arts authority, the master whose techniques defined the vocabulary of the story's combat. As Dragon Ball Z elevated power levels to cosmological magnitudes, Roshi became objectively relatively weak, and yet he persisted, respected and loved, appearing at tournaments and in moments of crisis with the same energy and the same eccentric humor that had defined him from his first chapter. In Dragon Ball Super, he was given extended combat sequences that were written with obvious affection, reminding audiences of the character he had been while acknowledging the character he had become. The relationship between Dragon Ball Classic and the concept of personal growth was never stated as a theme. It was simply lived in the structure of the story. Goku began the series not knowing what a girl was. He ended it married, a 3-year veteran of the world's most demanding martial arts program, the savior of the Earth from 2 separate apocalyptic threats, and the most capable fighter the world had ever seen. This arc of growth was not narrated or underlined. It was demonstrated through accumulated scenes, through the contrast between early Goku and later Goku, through the reader's own memory of where the character had started. Krillin's growth followed a parallel but distinct path. He began competitive, slightly devious, more interested in status than in genuine mastery. He ended Dragon Ball Classic as someone for whom the competition had been replaced by something deeper, a commitment to fighting not for triumph, but for the people around him. His friendship with Goku had changed him. His training had changed him. His grief at the death of his own master during the King Piccolo arc, Roshi's attempt at the evil containment wave, had changed him. He was not the same person who had arrived at Kameg House with a stack of magazines and a calculating smile. He was someone better, someone made better specifically by the company he had kept. The 23rd Tenkaichi Budokai featured a number of encounters that demonstrated how thoroughly the world had changed since the first tournament. Fighters who had been formidable threats in the 22nd Budokai were dispatched in early rounds by opponents who had advanced further in those 3 intervening years. The tournament was not just a competition. It was a measure of time, of how much had happened and how much everyone had grown in response to it. The bracket told a story before the first punch was thrown, simply by placing certain people in the same sections and allowing the reader to understand what each matchup meant. Kami's disguised participation in the 23rd Budokai added a layer of quiet drama to the earlier rounds. He had entered to observe Piccolo Jr. directly, to understand the threat the reincarnation posed before the final confrontation. This decision, the Guardian of Earth entering a martial arts tournament as a precaution, reflected the unusual nature of Dragon Ball Classic's world, where cosmic responsibilities and street-level competitions occupied the same space without contradiction. Kami was fighting in the same tournament where Chi-Chi was fighting for a marriage proposal. Both things were equally real within the story's logic, and both were treated with appropriate seriousness. Piccolo Jr.'s growing complexity through the 23rd Budokai was one of the arc's most carefully handled developments. He had come to destroy Goku and Kami. He had come to complete what his predecessor had failed to complete. And yet the intelligence he applied to his goal, the discipline of his training, the specific and considered nature of his tactics, all of these qualities were neutral in themselves, applicable to any end. The seed of something other than destruction was present in Piccolo Jr. from the beginning. Goku placed a senzu bean beside him and stepped away, and the audience was left to understand, without being told, that this was not merely mercy, but recognition. Goku saw something in Piccolo worth keeping. The Dragon Ball Classic era was also the era in which the rules of ki combat were first sketched into the world. Ki, life energy, the force that animated living beings, had existed in the story from the beginning, implicit in every technique and every transformation, but it was gradually articulated across the classic arc's later sagas into something that could be trained, shaped, directed, and measured. The concept of sensing ki, of detecting the presence and the proximate power level of another being through perception alone, was introduced at Kami's lookout when Mr. Popo blindfolded Goku and asked him to fight using only that awareness. This technique would become one of the foundational skills of Dragon Ball Z's combat. The power level system, later formalized through scouting devices called Scouters in Dragon Ball Z, was present in Dragon Ball Classic as an informal understanding that some fighters were more powerful than others, and that training could change these relationships over time. The series did not assign numbers to its characters' abilities during the Classic era, relying instead on the reader's narrative sense of relative strength. This approach kept the focus on the characters and the stakes rather than on numerical comparison. The introduction of formal power level measurements in Dragon Ball Z was one of the ways in which the sequel's approach differed from its predecessor, and many observers feel that the Classic era's absence of numbers served it well. Fire Mountain and its connection to the Ox King and Chi-Chi is one of the warmer origin stories in Dragon Ball Classic. The mountain had been aflame for years before Goku arrived, its castle surrounded by fire that no conventional means could extinguish. The Ox King, a large and intimidating warrior who had been a student of Master Roshi, was trapped outside his own home, unable to enter without being burned alive. His daughter Chi-Chi lived with the situation as a fact of her daily life, practical and unafraid. When Goku arrived and engaged with the problem of the fire, he was engaging with the domestic circumstances of a family. Not a kingdom or an empire, but a father and his daughter and their home. The scale was deliberately small, and the resolution, involving the magical Bancho fan and eventually the Kamehameha, was proportionate to it. Master Roshi's attempt to extinguish the fire on Fire Mountain with the Kamehameha was one of the most memorably counterproductive moments in the classic series. He fired the most powerful technique in his arsenal at the flames and made them dramatically worse. The Bancho fan, the proper tool for the job, had been lost in the chaos. Goku would later obtain a genuine Bancho fan from fortune teller Baba, allowing the fire to be properly extinguished. But by then the story had moved on, and the resolution of Fire Mountain was a quiet coda to an earlier adventure rather than a dramatic set piece. Toriyama tied these narrative threads back together with the same lack of ceremony with which he had left them open. The Ox King's relationship to Master Roshi connected him to the broader community of martial arts practitioners that Dragon Ball Classic assembled around its central characters. He was not a participant in the tournaments, not a fighter in the conflicts against the Red Ribbon Army or the Demon Kings. He was simply someone who had trained and lived and raised his daughter as best he could and was now part of Goku's extended family through Chi-Chi's marriage. This peripheral but persistent presence was characteristic of how Dragon Ball Classic built its world, not through elaborate backstory delivered in exposition, through the slow revelation that everyone in this world had a history, and that many of those histories intersected. Akira Toriyama's creative process during the Dragon Ball Classic years was documented in various interviews and the production notes of the Daizenshu volumes. He worked from a small studio at his home in Nagoya, and the isolation suited him. He preferred to think visually, working out fights and action sequences by sketching them before writing, finding the movement first and letting the dialogue follow. He was not, by his own account, a deeply analytical writer. He did not construct elaborate thematic frameworks or plan years ahead. He followed the story where it wanted to go, and, when it surprised him, he treated that surprise as useful information about where the next development lay. This improvisational quality gave Dragon Ball Classic some of its most unexpected pleasures. Characters who appeared for a single chapter became important. Directions the story seemed to be heading were suddenly abandoned for something better. The moment Oolong interrupted Pilaf's wish, for instance, there is no indication in Toriyama's process notes that this resolution was planned far in advance. It felt like the kind of solution that arrives when a creator is thinking clearly and quickly, following what is true to the characters rather than what is narratively convenient. Oolong was exactly the kind of person who would make that wish. The interruption was therefore the only conclusion that felt inevitable once it happened. The relationship between the manga and the anime produced some of the most interesting textural differences in Dragon Ball Classic. The anime's production schedule meant that it occasionally caught up to the manga and needed to slow down with filler episodes. These filler sequences were written by other writers at Toei Animation and did not involve Toriyama directly. Some of them were beloved, small adventures that felt like extensions of the series' spirit, even without its author's hand. Others were more mechanical, clearly designed to buy time rather than to add depth. Fans who encountered the manga first often had strong feelings about the filler, though the best of it has aged with a certain nostalgic grace of its own. There is a quality to Dragon Ball Classic that becomes clearer with time and distance, a quality of invention that is both casual and confident. Toriyama did not seem to be straining for ideas. The characters arrived fully formed and went where their natures took them. The world expanded not because it needed to, but because it wanted to. Because there was always somewhere else to go and something else to discover. This ease of invention is one of the rarest things in long-running serialized fiction, and Dragon Ball Classic possessed it in abundance. The series also possessed an unusual quality of acceptance. It accepted its own absurdity without embarrassment, and its own sincerity without irony. When the moon was destroyed to end a tournament fight, the story did not wink at the audience about the strangeness of this. When Goku proposed to Chi-Chi in the middle of the tournament arena, the story did not diminish the moment with self-awareness. When Android 8 refused to hurt people because he simply could not bring himself to do it, the story did not explain the anomaly of a weapon with a conscience. These things simply were, and the story's confidence in their reality made them real to the reader. The humor of Dragon Ball Classic was of a specific kind, clean, physical, rooted in character, never cruel. Roshi's lechery was the comedy of someone who was obviously good at heart and obviously absurd in his weaknesses, and the joke was always on him rather than on the people he bothered. Goku's social ignorance was the comedy of absolute honesty, a person who said what he saw and did what he intended without any of the filtering that social conditioning provides. Pilaf's repeated failures were the comedy of ambition entirely out of proportion to ability. None of this humor aged badly, because none of it depended on cynicism or condescension. It was the humor of a story that genuinely liked its characters, even its ridiculous ones. The Daizenshu guidebooks and the relationship between Dragon Ball Classic and the Daizenshu volumes that followed the series' completion provides a number of details that enrich the world without having been explicitly stated in the original story. These official supplementary volumes documented the world's geography, character histories, power levels, and production notes in a format that gave dedicated fans access to information Toriyama had carried in his head without fully articulating on the page. The Great Eight transformation, for instance, was documented in the Daishunshu as multiplying a Saiyan's combat power by a factor of 10. This was not stated within Dragon Ball Classic itself, but it provided a numerical framework for what viewers had already observed. that Goku transformed into a massive feral creature during the full moon and became capable of destruction far beyond his normal form. The tail was both the means of triggering the transformation and the vulnerability that ended it. Cutting the tail returned the Saiyan to their normal state immediately. Goku's tail was cut more than once across the classic series, and it grew back each time until Kami eventually removed it permanently during the training at the lookout. The Namekian origin of Kami and Piccolo Daimao was hinted at in Dragon Ball Classic through their biology, the ability to spawn offspring from the body, the regenerative capacity, the unusual physiology, but it was not named or explained within the original series. This restraint was characteristic of how Dragon Ball Classic handled its mythology. The answers were available to those who looked closely, but the story did not pause to explain itself. It trusted its audience to hold open questions comfortably, to sit with mystery rather than demanding resolution. This is one of the reasons Dragon Ball Classic ages so gracefully. It created its world rather than explaining it. The Dragon Ball's creation as extensions of Namekian biology gave them a quality that pure artifacts would not have possessed. They were living objects in some sense, tied to the guardian who had made them. When Kami was threatened or weakened, the Dragon Balls responded. When he was killed, they became inert stone permanently. This connection made the Dragon Balls vulnerable in a way that pure magical objects would not have been, and it tied the fate of the wishes to the fate of the people who had created them. Every wish granted by Shenron was, in a sense, an act performed through the living energy of one specific Namekian guardian who had chosen to offer his power to the world as a gift. The rules around what Shenron could and could not grant were established gradually across Dragon Ball Classic. He could not grant a wish beyond the power of his creator. He could not resurrect someone who had died of natural causes. He could not grant the same wish twice. These constraints shaped the series in ways both explicit and subtle. They created a grammar of limitation around infinite power, ensuring that the Dragon Balls were potent enough to drive the narrative, but not so omnipotent that they removed all stakes. Every wish came with conditions. Every miracle had a border. This, too, felt true to something human, the way even the most extraordinary gifts carry terms that the recipient must understand and accept. There is something particular about the way Dragon Ball Classic ended that deserves to be settled with quietly. The final chapter of the original Dragon Ball arc, before the story extended into Dragon Ball Z, showed Goku and Chi-Chi flying away on the Nimbus together, not toward a battle, not toward a tournament or a training ground or a destination with a threat waiting, just away, in the quiet, above the clouds, toward a life that was beginning rather than a crisis that needed resolving. The image was simple and bright, and entirely characteristic of the series at its most itself. Dragon Ball Classic had been, from its first panel to this last one, a story about a boy discovering the world. He had found friends. He had found enemies who became something else. He had climbed mountains and entered temples and crossed deserts and dove into seas and flown to clouds above the clouds. He had lost someone he loved and found a way to keep moving. He had fought for reasons that were not self-interested, for a promise to a child, for a friend who was gone, for a world that didn't know his name. He had ended each of the three great tournaments not as a champion, but as something better, as someone who had grown. The series never insisted on its own importance. It wore its mythology lightly, tucked its deeper themes beneath the surface of the adventure, and trusted the reader to feel what was there without needing it named. This restraint was not evasion. It was a form of respect for the story, for the characters who had moved through it, and for the reader who had come along. Dragon Ball Classic remains, for those who have spent time with it, one of the warmest places in the long history of the medium. Not perfect, not grand, not concerned with its own legacy, just full of life, full of movement, full of a boy on a cloud who was already, going somewhere worth arriving. Akira Toriyama created something in those years that he could not have fully anticipated. He drew a boy with a tail, and a girl with a radar, and a dragon that could grant a wish, and somehow, Out of those 3 modest pieces, he built a world that millions of people would return to for the rest of their lives. Not because it was the most sophisticated or the most profound, though it was often both of those things beneath its playful surface, but because it was generous, because it believed in its characters, because it took the world seriously enough to fill it with wonder, and took its readers seriously enough to let them find that wonder themselves. 300 facts, 300 small windows into the world that Dragon Ball Classic built, and each one, when looked at closely, opens onto something larger, a choice made by a tired artist at his desk, a voice actor finding the exact right quality for a character she would inhabit for decades, a young reader in Japan turning a page and meeting for the first time a boy on a cloud in a world that was suddenly, inexplicably his. Thanks for drifting through these Dragon Ball stories with me tonight. If you're ready for more, there's another calm video waiting just to the left. Let it guide you deeper into rest. You might fall asleep to something new.